The first American who touched the engine didn't believe it was real. His fingers came away with flakes of rust, not carbon scoring, not heat damage, rust, on a jet engine that had just been flying at over 500 miles per hour. He looked at his commanding officer, his face pale, and whispered something that would change everything they thought they knew about the enemy. The engine wasn't made of steel. It was made of compressed sheet metal and wood glue. This was April 1945, a small airfield in Bavaria, still smoking from artillery fire. The war was ending, but nobody had told the machines. Scattered across the tarmac were aircraft that looked like they belonged in the future. Sleek, predatory, nothing like the propeller-driven fighters the Americans had been flying. These were Messerschmitt Me-262s, the world's first operational jet fighters, and the U.S. Army Air Forces wanted one intact. Captain Robert Shaw had seen a lot in 2 years of war, but he'd never seen anything move like the 262. 2 weeks earlier, his squadron had encountered them over Germany. They appeared out of nowhere, screaming past his P-51 Mustang like his plane was standing still. His wingman had fired, missed by a mile. The 262 didn't even bother turning around. It just climbed, faster than gravity should allow, and vanished into the clouds. Shaw had radioed back to base with a report that sounded insane. Enemy aircraft, no propellers, speed estimated at 500 knots. His commander had thought he'd been hit in the head. But now, standing beside one on the ground, Shaw realized the reports hadn't been exaggerated. If anything, they'd been too conservative. The thing was beautiful in a dangerous way. Twin engines slung under swept wings, a narrow fuselage painted in fading camouflage, bullet holes stitched across the tail. This one had been abandoned by its pilot, out of fuel, left behind in the chaos of retreat. Shaw's orders were simple: get it back to the States. Let the engineers figure out how it worked. That's when Sergeant Jack Harlow, a mechanic from Detroit, opened the engine cowling and stopped moving. Shaw walked over, expecting to see some kind of advanced alloy, something that explained how the Germans had leapfrogged a decade of aviation technology. Instead, Harlow was staring at an engine that looked like it had been built in a high school shop class. The turbine blades were thin, discolored. Some of them were cracked. The casing was dented. And when Harlow ran his hand along the interior, it flaked, like old paint on a barn door. Shaw crouched down beside him. The smell hit him first. Not oil, not fuel, something chemical, acidic, the kind of smell that stays in your throat. He touched the metal. It was rough, pitted. In some places, it looked like it was dissolving. Harlow pulled a small blade from the surface and held it up to the light. It wasn't steel. It was some kind of low-grade alloy. Brittle. Cheap. The kind of material you'd use for a temporary fix, not for an engine that had to withstand the heat and pressure of a jet turbine. They called over Lieutenant David Brenner, an engineer who'd worked for Pratt & Whitney before the war. He'd helped design some of the most advanced piston engines in the world. But this was different. This was a jet. A technology so new that only the British had working prototypes, and even those were experimental. Brenner knelt beside the engine, pulled out a pocket magnet, and ran it along the turbine blades. It barely stuck. Not steel. Not even close. He looked up at Shaw with an expression somewhere between disbelief and horror. The Germans had built a jet engine out of materials that shouldn't survive the stress. Junkers Motor Works, the designation read. Brenner had heard rumors about it. Allied intelligence had photos, blurry images of strange aircraft with no propellers. But seeing it up close was different. The engineering was brilliant, elegant even. But the execution was desperate. The blades were made of an alloy called chromadur, a mix of chromium, manganese, and nitrogen. Developed because Germany didn't have access to the high-grade nickel and cobalt needed for real turbine blades. This was a substitute, a gamble, and somehow it worked for about 25 hours. Then the engine would destroy itself. Shaw stood up and looked around the airfield. There were 6 more Messerschmitt Me-262 scattered across the field. Some had been cannibalized for parts. Others looked intact. But every single one of them had engines that were falling apart. The Germans had built a fleet of jets that could outrun anything in the sky, but they couldn't keep them flying. It wasn't a lack of skill. It wasn't a lack of vision. It was a lack of resources. The same resources the Allies had in abundance. Brenner pulled a notebook from his coat and started sketching. Shaw watched him work, watched the way his hands moved across the page, fast and precise. He was already thinking ahead, already imagining what American engineers could do with this design if they had access to real materials, high-temperature steel, nickel alloys, precision manufacturing. The 262 was a glimpse of the future, but it was a future the Germans couldn't afford to build. As the sun dropped behind the trees, casting long shadows across the airfield, Shaw heard a sound. Faint first, then louder. The whine of jet engines. He turned and saw 2 more 262s low on the horizon, coming in fast. They weren't attacking. They were limping home. One of them had smoke trailing from its left engine. The other was flying crooked, like the pilot was fighting to keep it level. They passed overhead, close enough that Shaw could see the scorch marks on the fuselage, the patches of bare metal where the paint had burned away. And then they were gone, disappearing into the dusk. Shaw looked back at the captured jet, at the crumbling engine, at the desperate ingenuity that had built something extraordinary out of nothing. He thought about the pilots who'd flown these machines, knowing they might not make it back. Not because of enemy fire, but because the engine might quit at any moment. That took a different kind of courage, or maybe desperation. He wasn't sure which. Harlow closed the engine cowling and wiped his hands on his jacket. He looked at Shaw and asked the question that was on everyone's mind. If the Germans could do this with scrap metal and hope, what could they have done with the resources the Allies had? Shaw didn't answer, because the answer was too dangerous to say out loud. The Me-262 arrived at Wright Field in Ohio 3 weeks later, crated and shipped under armed guard. By then, word had already spread through the intelligence community. The Germans had operational jets, plural, not prototypes, not experiments, combat aircraft, flying missions, shooting down bombers. And the engines were made of materials that shouldn't work. That last part was what kept the engineers awake at night. Captain Shaw had flown back with the aircraft, along with Brenner and Harlow. They'd been ordered to stay with the project, to help the stateside teams understand what they were looking at. The moment the crate was opened, a crowd formed. Engineers, metallurgists, military brass. Everyone wanted to see the machine that had outrun American fighters, but when they saw the engine, the room went quiet. Dr. Helen Cartwright, one of the few women working in military aeronautics, was the first to speak. She'd been developing high-temperature alloys for the Air Force, working on the theory that jet propulsion was the future. But her designs required nickel, cobalt, molybdenum, rare metals that were expensive and difficult to source. She walked up to the UMO 004, ran her hand along the turbine blades, and laughed. Not because it was funny, because it was absurd. The Germans had done the impossible. They'd built a functional jet engine out of garbage. Over the next 3 days, the team disassembled the engine piece by piece. Every component was measured, weighed, analyzed. The turbine blades were photographed under microscopes. The combustion chamber was tested for heat resistance. The fuel system was traced and documented. And with every discovery, the picture became clearer. The Me-262 wasn't a technological miracle. It was an act of desperation, disguised as innovation. The Chromodor blades couldn't handle sustained high temperatures. After about 10 hours of operation, they'd start to warp.
By 20 hours, they'd crack. By 25, they'd shatter. The Germans knew this. They'd designed the engine to be disposable. Each UMO-004 was expected to last for 1 or 2 combat missions before being replaced. And because they couldn't manufacture them fast enough, pilots were ordered to conserve their jets, to only engage when absolutely necessary. The 262 could fly faster than anything in the sky, but only in short bursts, only when it mattered most. Brenner stood in front of a blackboard covered in calculations, explaining the engineering to a room full of officers who didn't want to hear it. The Germans had been cut off from global supply chains. Their access to nickel had been severed. Their chromium reserves were dwindling. So they'd improvised. They developed an alloy that could survive just long enough to do the job. It was brilliant. It was reckless. And it had almost worked. One of the officers, a colonel with graying hair and a chest full of medals, asked the question everyone was thinking. If the Germans had access to American resources, could they have won the air war? Brenner paused. He looked at Shaw, then back at the colonel. The answer was complicated. The 262 was faster than anything the Allies had. It could climb higher, turn sharper, but it was also fragile. Temperamental. It needed perfect conditions to operate, smooth runways, high-quality fuel, experienced pilots. The Germans had none of those things by 1945, so the jets, as advanced as they were, couldn't change the outcome. But the potential was there, and that's what scared everyone, because the war in Europe was over, but the war in the Pacific wasn't. And if the Japanese had somehow gotten their hands on this technology, if they'd managed to build their own jets, the invasion of the home islands would have been a bloodbath. The 262 proved that jet propulsion wasn't science fiction. It was real, it was operational, and it was only going to get better. Dr. Cartwright pulled Shaw aside after the briefing. She wanted to know what it had been like seeing the 262 in the air. Shaw thought about it for a moment. He remembered the sound, not the roar of a piston engine, but a high-pitched scream, like the air itself was being torn apart. He remembered the way it moved, effortless, predatory. And he remembered the fear, the realization that the rules of air combat had changed, and nobody had told him. He told her all of that, and then he told her something else, something he hadn't put in his report. The day after they'd captured the jet, a German pilot had been found hiding in the woods near the airfield. He was young, maybe 20. His uniform was torn. His face was covered in soot. When the MPs brought him in, Shaw had been there. The pilot had looked at the captured 262, and for a moment, something like pride had flickered across his face. Then it was gone, replaced by exhaustion, defeat. Shaw had asked him through a translator what it was like to fly the jet, and the pilot had smiled, a tired, sad smile, and he had said one word: unforgivable. Shaw never figured out what he meant. Unforgivable that the war had come to this? Unforgivable that they'd built something so advanced and still lost? Unforgivable that young men had been sent into the sky in machines that were as likely to kill them as the enemy. Maybe all of it. Maybe none of it. By the end of the week, the Air Force had made its decision. The Me-262 would be studied, reverse-engineered. Its secrets would be incorporated into the next generation of American jets. The Germans had shown what was possible. Now the Americans would show what was practical. Within 5 years, the U.S. would have its own operational jet fighters. Within 10, they'd have jets that could break the sound barrier. The 262 opened a door, and once a door like that is opened, it can never be closed. Shaw stood in the hangar one last time before heading back to his base. The Me-262 sat under bright lights, stripped down, exposed. It didn't look dangerous anymore. It looked tired, like it had given everything it had, and had nothing left. He thought about the pilots who'd flown these machines, the engineers who'd built them, the desperation that had driven a nation to gamble everything on a piece of technology that barely worked. And he thought about the future, about what came next, because the Me-262 wasn't just a weapon, it was a warning, a glimpse of a world where wars wouldn't be won by courage or numbers, but by technology, by whoever could build the fastest, the deadliest, the most advanced machines. The age of the dogfight was ending. The age of the missile was beginning. And somewhere, in a lab or a hangar or a secret facility, the next impossible machine was already being built. Shaw walked out into the Ohio sunlight, the sound of the hangar doors closing behind him. The war was over, but the race had just begun.